Let's put the Birthday Massacre albums in order of preference. Welcome to ByCandlelight, beaming goth, darkwave and post-punk straight into your brain, but only those not wearing protective helmets. So, the impossible task of ranking the albums by the Birthday Massacre. Not really impossible because I've managed it. A tiny bit of history. So the Birthday Massacre formed in 1999 in Canada. Originally called Imagica, named after a Clive Barker novel, they changed their name to the Birthday Massacre in 2002. They've since said that the name works well with their music, as it generally combines melodic and nostalgic synth parts with crunching guitars. A kind of light and dark, good and evil, that sort of thing. Their current lineup is Chibi, Rainbow, Falcor, Owen, Philip and Brett. They are the band that I've seen the most, and I think that's because they're based in Canada, so for them to come over to the UK is a big deal. Last time I saw them, which was in 2022, I did one of those VIP meet the band kind of things. I don't usually do the VIP meetup thing, and I think that's just because it can feel a bit like a business transaction. But with this band, it's so different because they're so lovely and they've just got a great camaraderie between them and they just have a laugh with you, and yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. So really enjoyed meeting them. Fabulous bunch of people. Another thing to say is that when I play this band to people who aren't really into the gothy thing, they just love them straight away. I've not introduced them to anyone who's not like them, and I've always wondered why they're not globally known. So here comes the usual ranking statement. All of these albums are great, and they're all great in their own way, but one of the albums has got to come top and another album has to come bottom, and there needs to be all those albums in the middle. I might rank these differently next month, next year, but for now, this is where I've placed them all. Also, although they released 9 albums, I will be missing out their first album, Nothing and Nowhere. This is because they chose to rework quite a lot of the tracks on that album and then subsequently place them on future albums. So, at number 8, we have their latest album, Fascination, released in 2022. So while this may suffer a little bit from being the latest album, i.e. not being played as often, it still has some great moments on it. Opening with the dreamy title track, this album does start well with its epic chorus, and Dreams of You skips along very nicely, as does most of the album. I think for me, there isn't really the centerpiece on this album to bring all the tracks together. On other albums, there's at least one track that absolutely hits you and helps glue all the other tracks together. Definitely not a bad album, but one that suffers due to the high watermark set by their other releases. At 7, we have 2020's Diamonds. Released in March of that year, this album sadly suffered at the hands of the pandemic. Having to cancel their tour for this album completely meant that this album didn't get the promotion and the live exposure that it deserved. In a similar way to Fascination, this album just doesn't quite sparkle with those big anthems like some of their other albums do. Saying that, the title track is quite infectious with its drums and guitar groove. Flashback is also hugely dynamic and catchy with its as above so below sung chorus and its guitar solo. Overall, Diamonds feels just an inch more coherent than Fascination. Definitely not one to start with if you're new to the band, but once you're embedded into their sound, this is definitely an album to wade into. Number 6 is Superstition, released in 2014. For me, this album starts to bring in those anthemic tracks, such as Diary, Superstition, and the beautiful Rain. Elsewhere, the sneery Destroyer brings a different feel, which breaks up the album nicely. Beyond is vintage Birthday Massacre, with its twinkling synths and euphoric chorus. A great album worthy of repeated listenings. Next, at number 5, we have Under Your Spell, released in 2017. Out of all the albums I've ranked so far, this is the first album, in my opinion, to bring in those centerpiece tracks that I mentioned. So I'm going to start with Counterpain. Oh my god, this is essential Birthday Massacre. Crunching guitar intro, subdued verses, and then an opening out into a racing chorus. And oh my god, those machine gun drums. The beautiful title track is also worth your time. The part menacing, part sweet No Tomorrow is a perfect illustration of that schizophrenic light and dark approach that they do so well. And the lowest low is a slow burn slab of beautiful synths. Worth it for Counterpain and Under Your Spell alone, this is a worthy number 5. Now it gets hard. At number 4 is 2012's Hide and Seek. Beginning with one of my favourite TBM tracks, Leaving Tonight. This album has paid for itself already, but it doesn't leave it there as it leads nicely on to the metal of Down. A sweetness and light verse heads full on into a growled chorus. Moving into Play With Fire, the album really does keep those plates spinning. Calling is catchy and nostalgic, and Cover My Eyes holds its own against some of their best slower tracks. A very strong and consistent album. Coming in at 3 is 2010's Pins and Needles. It gets an immediate kickstart with those forward in the mix guitars and just a wall of synths. With the sound of a cassette tape starting, Pale is classic TBM with its guitars and synths vying beautifully for attention. And Control keeps you on the roller coaster for another breathtaking ride. By the time you get to Shallow Grave, you can't quite believe the quality of this album. Sideways and Midnight keep you buoyant until you reach the title track. If you don't nod your head to the intro, check your pulse. The innocence of the verse gives way to the euphoria of the chorus, and then it's straight back into those malevolent guitars. This is very nearly a perfect album. If you come to the Birthday Massacre for the first time at this point, you'll be hearing one of their best. At number 2, it's 2005's Violet. This is where it all started for me. So Violet contains some of those reworked and re-recorded tracks from their debut Nothing and Nowhere that I mentioned earlier. Video Kid was my actual introduction to them, as it was featured on a compilation called Neo-Goth, alongside other tracks by VNV Nation and Covenant. Violet definitely has more of a raw sound to it. Lover's End is like a wall of guitars with synths peeking over it.
What?
Its menacing verse leads to a sweeter chorus, and then straight back to malevolence. Happy Birthday's gorgeous guitars lead to a whispered verse, only to unload a classic chorus on you. Big Single Blue, with its amazing video, plays tag with guitars and electronics, and is probably one of the best examples of what the band does best. Elsewhere, The Dream and Holiday are up there with some of their best tracks. Making these wildly contrasting segments in their songs is the very essence of their sound. An amazing album. So my number 1 is 2007's Walking with Strangers. Often cited as their best album, I would totally agree with this. Bar maybe one track, this album, for me, plays like a greatest hits album. I read somewhere that the concept of this album was based around school, having to spend these years with these people who, at first, are strangers to you. This theme can be heard throughout the album, as a lot of the tracks are bookended with the sounds of children playing. Also, the album cover seems to show a school-like building with children playing outside. This album is too loaded with amazing tracks for me to talk about each one. Some of the highlights are Red Stars, Kill the Lights, To Die For, Weekend, and the Cure-inspired movie. The only track I actively skip is the title track. It just feels a little bit too high for Chibi's voice in parts. I love how most tracks segue into the next, making this a journey of different emotions, including nostalgia, excitement and pathos. So a lot like school, really. This album is a part of my very being and I could not live without it. One to be played in its entirety. So I love this band. They can meld nostalgia, euphoria, excitement and malevolence into a coherent whole and make it sound so original. The fact that they're friendly, appreciative of their fans and are amazing live is a substantial bonus. So that is my ranking. Would you have ranked them any differently? And what is your favourite Birthday Massacre album? Let me know. Until next time, see you later.